This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in pretending that my graduate education was useful. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined today by Dr. Mary Jane Rubenstein, professor of religion and science and society at Wesleyan University, an affiliate there of the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program, author and co-editor of several incredible books, including Strange Wonder, The Closure of Metaphysics and the Opening of Awe, Worlds Without End, The Many Lives of the Multiverse, Entangled Worlds, Religion, Science, and New Materialisms, Pantheologies, Gods, Worlds, Monsters, Image, Three Inquiries in Technology and Imagination, and the forthcoming book, Astrotopia, The Dangerous Religion of the Corporate Space Race. Dr. Rubenstein, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. It's an incredibly generous use of your time, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you today.
Hi, it's so nice to be talking to you today. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. My first question is a very general one. So your work in religious studies, sort of across the board, crosses over with both traditional philosophical inquiries and with the philosophy of science in some very specific ways. I'm curious, as someone who has a background in many, but not all of these things, how did your work evolve in this direction? Like, how did these interests come together for you as a scholar?
Great, thanks so much. Well, I guess I kind of tumbled into religious studies by accident. It was one of those things where I accidentally took a class in college and then found out when I was trying to take other things that I kept writing about religion. I just sort of kept coming back to it. I think at the institution where I studied as an undergrad, the religious studies department was very philosophically constituted. That at that time in the mid 90s, what we call continental philosophy was being done in basically the English and the religion departments, and then analytic philosophy was being done in the philosophy department. So I was very excited about philosophy as well, and philosophy as a way of approaching religious studies, and found the kind of philosophy I was excited about being done most energetically, I think, in the religion department, a little bit in the English department. So I guess I've always been drawn to the kind of abstract thinking that keeps at the center of its questioning why it matters or why it's important or why anybody would be interested in such a thing. So I've never quite been taken by the question of, whether the kind of red that I see is the same as the red that you see, or whether, right? But I'm very excited about why it is that certain communities would want to insist upon, say, the omnipotence of their divinity, and others would want to focus on the fallibility of theirs, or things like that. These things, those bigger abstract philosophical questions are exciting to me because they're tied to, human sociality and human psychology and human affect and excitement. The science stuff really didn't hit for me until I was well into my career. Well, I was teaching. I was almost tenured. I was really just like far along into things, and I guess it's a similar answer, which is that part of the reason I was so excited about the kinds of philosophies that I've been excited about, 19th, 20th century French, German stuff, is that religion tends to show up there in sort of unexpected and subtle ways where you're not expecting it, right? This tends to be at least explicitly sort of atheistic, non-theistic, anti-theistic philosophy, Nietzsche, for example, Heidegger, for example. And yet you see sort of theological and mythological and religious ideas and tendencies sort of coming through them in unexpected ways. I started seeing that happening in the sciences, in some of the sciences, as I started reading around more widely in developments in contemporary cosmology, contemporary physics, nonlinear biologies, things like that. And I guess that was what excited me. It was like, oh, okay, now maybe I can look elsewhere, like somewhere other than the dying or dead French and German guys, like a different place, a different site where religion is showing up in unexpected and exciting ways. So I guess that's how I got there.
I love so many parts of that answer. The dead French and German guys made me laugh because when I taught my world religions elective for my middle schoolers this past year, I start them out with like a very, like, what is religious studies? And we talk about theories. And I kind of broadcast for them ahead of time. I'm like, I don't like theories. And one of the reasons I don't like theories is because it's a bunch of dead white guys talking about, you know, like we've figured religion out, boys, you know. that's kind of the whole attitude when you read their work, and I'm not about that. And also because I'm just not a reductionist, like by nature. I'm very much a like, no, yeah, both and kind of guy, sort of across the board. And so that made me laugh. And then I really liked the way that you phrase that as you have a big concern for like why it matters when you do this work. Because that is something that I see that comes, and I have questions about this. Like it seems to come across to me in your work that there's always a so what? So like, what do we do with all of this, right? Which I so appreciate, because my background in religious studies was amazing. It was very like Ninian Smart based, like let's bracket every question of sort of ultimate importance about anything that we study. And that's great, because confessional neutrality and, you know, all across the board, that's really important to doing the kind of work that you do in scholarship of religion. It's really important to doing the kind of work that you do in a secular university. But there is always that lingering like, yeah, and why does this matter, right? Like, that's sort of unavoidable to me. And so I love how your work never shies away from that. So anyway, just praise. I don't know, just throwing praise out there. Yeah. I wanted to start with Strange Wonder. In that book, you trace the discomfort of Western philosophy with wonder through Heidegger, Levinas, Nancy, and Derrida. And you identify wonder as this kind of liminal space where deconstruction and change are both possible and necessary for our particular moment. So kind of building on my last question, how has wonder factored into your own scholarship, and how can we practice wonder in a way that's not seeking to kind of immediately extinguish it in a very philosophical, existential, even religious sense, through some kind of like discovery or arrival, or, you know, immediately trying to categorize our experiences that lead to this wonder?
Right. Cool. Thanks. So I actually got to the wonder question through what I then learned was something like a process of wonder, which is to say, I was just minding my own business. I was in a seminar. I was a grad student. I was thinking I was going to write a dissertation on Kierkegaard. That was what I was going to do, because I loved Kierkegaard. Didn't know what I was going to do it on, but it was going to be something about him and how much I loved him, and how he was probably waiting for me in the eschaton, like there, just preparing a place for me to sit.
I hope he is.
Yeah,
I hope so. Yeah,
it would be lovely, because I've got a lot to tell him. So Kierkegaard. So anyway, I was, and I was in this grad seminar, and the person who was teaching it, as she was talking about something else, said in passing, so she mentioned something about wonder, and she said in passing, which, as you know, Plato says is the origin of all philosophy. And then she kept going. And I was like, wonder is the origin of all philosophy? I mean, I was a PhD student. I had never heard this before, that wonder was the origin of all philosophy. Never heard it. I had been in philosophy classes. I was almost a philosophy major. I did philosophical theology as a grad student, like for 2 master's degrees. Had never heard it. And I was astonished. And that kind of, sudden, groundlessness and unfamiliarity of what you thought you understood, that goes to like the very root of something, like, oh my, at the origin of all of Plato, like that guy says that wonder is at the origin. I can't even explain. I was so shocked and so divested of like an entire field about which I had thought that I had some kind of understanding, that I have no idea what the class was on. Frankenstein, maybe, I don't know. I started writing, because I remember thinking, like, how can this be the case when, in my experience at least, it is the work of philosophy to do everything it can to assure that it doesn't subject itself to something like wonder, right? To gain certainty, to gain kind of sober understanding, and to present proofs rationally and things like that. Like, what the hell is going on with wonder? And so I just followed it. So I think methodologically, the work of remaining wonderstruck right, like as an academic, if that's what you're asking, would be to allow oneself to be carried along almost like a jellyfish by these currents that kind of hit you, and then say like, okay, and I ended up going to I gave it a number of like days of thought, went to my advisor and said, I think I want to write a dissertation on wonder. And he was like, oh, please do Kierkegaard. Like, what the hell is wonder? No idea what you're talking to me about. Like, please do anything else. Like, what is it? What are you talking about? I was like, well, that's just the thing, isn't it? What is it? Right, this is that. Yeah, that's why I have to write about it. And he was like, no. But he was kind and let me pursue it, and that of course became the dissertation, which then I revised into the first book. This same thing has sort of guided me the whole way. It's like I don't know what's next, and then I happened to read a piece in the New York Times that talks about dark, and I actually thought the second book was going to be on the Anglicans. They were having like a big sex crisis, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna write about this Anglican sex crisis, and that's what I was planning on doing. I was writing a bunch of articles about it, and then I read this thing in the New York Times that was talking about this stuff that physicists had just discovered called dark energy, and I was like, dark energy? Why would it? That sounds like something out of Star Wars, or it sounds like something out of, and that they were all terrified by it, and they were all horrified, and it wasn't what they expected, and they were like, this is ugly, and it's terrifying, and it's like hell without the fire, and it's like, what is generating all this stuff? And just that, and suddenly like science wasn't what I thought it was, right? And that's what got me into what became the Multiverse book. So this is just kind of the way I think that I tend to go along, is like being willing to be shocked by something and then to try to follow it. And that following, in the process of that following, I try to keep that like hold on to that sense of surprise and like deepen it, rather than to try to and I try to come to terms with it, try to like offer some understanding and some way of mapping it, but not in an effort to like shut down a question or to make it seem suddenly comprehensible, but just to like deepen our appreciation of how strange our behaviors are and our ways of accounting for the world are.
Yeah. Thesis and dissertation supervisors have an almost rabbinic responsibility to try and dissuade you at least 3 times, right?
That's right.
Yeah. That answer reminds me of I read an article a while ago, I think probably in Psyche, and it was about the Zhuangzi, about how there's this line in there that animals are closer to the Tao because they don't have a concept of the Tao, right? They don't have like an interfering mental construct that sort of mediates their experience. They just have the experience. And that, coming to that realization in my own work, led me to a very similar place that you're describing, of realizing like, well, how do I know what's religion and what's science and what's philosophy and what's, knowing how to like change my air filter, what are the differences between these things? They're actually all assumptions I make about how the world works, right? And when I allow myself to kind of, as you put it, like be shocked by, oh wow, reality is really strange, right? A lot of those barriers fall down, and I feel like that's definitely true in the philosophy of science broadly. Insofar as right, and this is kind of like a classic complaint, but when like, sorry, this is my dog holding to come inside because it's hot out. Daisy, come inside. Good girl. That may or may not happen a few times. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, like, when sort of popular figures in the sciences, like, your Bill Nyes or your Neil deGrasse Tysons or your Paul Davies or your Brian Coxes of the world, when they do interviews and they get asked questions about religion and they're like, oh well, do I believe in kind of stereotype popular version of Western God? It's like, well, that's not really the way to ask this question, right? Because it's like you're talking about aspects of reality that are so arcane and so removed and so frankly magical that it's like, you're actually, I mean, you're far closer to kind of the traditional history of philosophy and theology on questions of God than you really think you are. right? Which I think is huge, like transitioning to the Multiverse book, which was my first read of yours. And I gotta say, is like probably one of the top 5 works of scholarship I pitched to friends of mine who want to like know what should I, like, how do I read, like what's good academic work that I can read? Both because it's such an amazing treatment of the topic, but also it's just like, it's a great example of how to do what we were talking about earlier, like historical scholarship that also wrestles with speculative questions and is like willing to engage the conversation rather than just record it. So like you've given an extended interview online about the multiverse and its intersections with questions of philosophy and religion. I don't want to reduplicate that. But I am curious how the multiverse intersects with religion, specifically at the place of wonder. For me anyway, the idea that I exist somewhere in like Tegmark's ultimate multiverse, where like every conceivable reality exists, points me very much in the direction of like Kusanas and Vedanta or Kashmiri Shaivism, like a kind of classical panentheism. It's exactly what I expect if God is truly infinite from within my own tradition. I'm curious, how does the multiverse inspire your imagination, both like academically, religiously, and otherwise?
I think that the multiverse tends mainly to remain for me a second order concern, that I tend to be most fascinated by the way that physicists talk about the multiverse, much more so than I am about the multiverse itself, I have to say. I can get to that in a minute, or to the second part in a minute, but the first half is, so, and I think this is what you were getting at in the first half of what you said, which is that I see in writings about the multiverse, especially popular science writings about the multiverse, which are reliably pitched in such a way that they will finally put to rest the question of whether there is a God by disproving the existence. They will disprove the existence of God by proving the existence of the multiverse. I find it comically, sort of tragically in its own way, and like adorably persistent, that to see that the multiverse becomes itself, as you're saying, a kind of a theological concept, a cosmo-theological concept, that what we end up trading is an infinite, omnipotent God for an infinite number of worlds. Metaphysically, I think I have absolutely no idea of saying which of these hypotheses is more extravagant than the other, right? An infinite benevolent personal God or an infinite number of worlds we can never see, but that these seem equally extravagant prospects. Which doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just, what it means is that cosmology in this particular incarnation of itself has not gotten itself free of its theological rival. And it doesn't need to be rivals with theology, except that these damn physicists keep saying that what they're doing is anti-theological work, that what they're right. If they were accounting for it in some other way, if they didn't keep bringing it up, I wouldn't be pointing it out. But these books always start by saying, well, you think that there's a God, but there isn't because there's a multiverse. And then it's just that the multiverse then takes on this function. So the source of wonder for me is at the place that the multiverse occupies within the sciences, which is to say it becomes this kind of catch-all for their metaphysical distress and their and uncertainties and things like that. So this is that it's exciting, it's fun, it's amazing, it sometimes makes me crazy, and so that becomes the sort of space of wonder for me. When it comes to the first order stuff, which is to say, thinking about the millions upon millions of me's there may be in some quantum mechanical many-world-y universe in which I either had the coffee or didn't have the coffee, or tripped on the stairs or didn't trip on the stairs, or left the ball on the stairs so I could trip on the ball on the stairs or didn't. I don't know why this doesn't do it for me. I can't get all that carried away in excitement, mystical excitement about the numberless copies of myself out there. in these, and I don't know if it's because I'm too much of a Nietzschean and don't think that those other me's would be me, right? That for Nietzsche, the self is only constituted by its numberless accidents, and that like a you who could actually, in my case, draw anything other than a stick figure, like a me who could draw anything, would not be me. I would not be me if I could draw. I would be some other person. That there is no essence of us. We're only composed by the innumerable accidents that then come to compose us. So if you change any one of those accidents, this is why Nietzsche says like you need to be able to affirm everything and all of its idiocy, like including when you burned yourself on the toaster, because there is no you independently of that burn on the toaster, right? So I don't. It may be that I don't share the philosophical stance that says that there's an essence of me such that a me who decided to dye her hair pink instead of blue would still be me. She'd be some other person, and that's delightful, but I'm not, right? Or if it's that I think that there's a fallacy here of what like Whitehead would call a fallacy of misplaced concretion, that there's a mistake in substituting the virtual or the possible, right? Had I done this, I would have become a person who fell in love with my coffee maker and ran away to Greece. That's a possibility, right? An unactualized possibility. And there seems to be in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, at least, a metaphysical error in substituting that virtual, that possible for an actual, and saying, therefore, there is actually a world in which I did these things. That just seems to be like a basic philosophical error to me. So I don't know if it's just the basic philosophical error part that drives me crazy. Or if it's just that I don't know ethically that it makes a ton of sense to be I don't know, sort of lost in all of the things that might have been or could have been in other ways, when really we need to think about worlds that might still be. So I
Okay, continue.
Great. So I think that there's an ethical problem in beginning and ending where most multiverse cosmologies begin and end, which is to say, with this world as it is, with me in particular, right? There's always that reach out to the you. If you happen to have figured out how to play guitar when you were 13, right? Then maybe your whole life would have been different. You would have been a folk singer. I worry that it starts and ends with me, and then I get stuck thinking about all the me's who might be, right? And even these recent movies that have come out, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that new Doctor Strange, and that book, that terrible book about the girl who keeps having to go through her different lives until she finds the right husband. What the heck is that called? Anyway, it's terrible. Matt Hogue, I forget what the book is called. All of these are telling these tiny little stories about these sort of like bourgeois existences maybe being a little bit different, and that's where it sticks us. I think a better way to think is, if we're going to think about the multiverse, is to think about like genuinely different worlds. I taught this class last year called Colonizing Space. And we were talking about the assumption that our billionaires have, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, that we can't live any way other than the way that the members of overdeveloped nations live. Rich members of overdeveloped nations live. There's no other way to live. We have to keep, using more energy, consuming more crap, generating more trash, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, since the resources of the earth are finite and our will and our desire and our, longing for capital is infinite, we need more resources. Therefore, we have to go into outer space. Right? My students find it more probable that we will learn to live on Mars than they do that we could just use less crap, just eat less energy and consume less stuff, and say abolish capitalism, right? It is easier, this is what Jameson says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. They can't imagine a different way to live. And so I think that those kinds of, particularly those kinds of like fiction, of speculative fiction, that ask us to imagine genuinely different worlds, where, for example, you don't pursue profit over all other things, basic assumption, are more fruitful speculations than like, oh, what would have happened if I had been a tea drinker instead of a coffee drinker or something like that. Yeah. It's a long answer. I'm sorry. It's a long, very long answer.
That's what we like here. Yeah, the joke from the Doctor Strange movie that I liked along those lines was when she says, food is free in most universes. I don't know what's going on in yours. But yeah, I agree with you that there's something, and I was going to bring up pop culture because it seems like the multiverse is a hot idea in pop culture at the moment. But I mean, I've been a comic book nerd my whole life. And one thing that I do notice that's a little bit different from the way that, say, like Marvel Comics deals with this, from the way that, like, Disney's MCU deals with this, is that in the comics, the multiverse is typically a much more like philosophical, like, hey, like, wow, like the profligacy of reality, right? Like it's, endless worlds that all proceed from the one and return to the one in this like eternal kind of breathing forth and coming back and whatever. And, it's the source of all of this magic and beauty and also like kind of horror at the same time, right? And it's like, it's much more a let's do cosmology to kind of open your mind sort of thing. And it does seem to be the case that the only way to make such a cosmology-based movie to filmmakers seems to be like, no, it's just got to be about this like one guy and his problems and or this one lady and her problems. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there's something to that, I guess, but I feel like one of the reasons we keep throwing our money at sci-fi and fantasy historically is that the mundane world is often, because of the reasons that you identify, right? Like we're surrounded by crap, we're surrounded by stuff. It can be very suffocating. So like imagining a bigger world helps us sometimes, it can, doesn't always, to think about like, oh, hey, how could I make the world a little bit more magic? How could I make the world a little bit better? That's what cosmology at its best kind of does, right? Is it invites us to think like, no, you don't live in this like quantified, right? Like everything has a price, everything has an economic material value. You live in literal magic, right? Like you exist in a reality that's actually magic, and that's all that our science seems to tell us about it. I don't know, like that seems to the just scattered thoughts, kind of riffing on what you're saying here. That leads, as for this being a digression, I find that like when I think out my questions ahead of time, kind of no matter what happens in the conversation, it always seems to follow that path. So maybe I should rethink the name of this. That sort of leads me to pantheologies. I do have questions about the Astrotopia book, but I wanted to save those for the end. In that book, you point out kind of to this point that the revulsion of Western philosophy towards pantheism is the way that it seems to collapse certain dualisms, but they're dualisms that have like a social utility for various hegemonies. Like it's problematic for, say, like German idealists to come out and say like, yes, pantheism, because it's a very, like it challenges a very patriarchal and kind of anthropocentric view of reality, right? And I also note that such revulsion in contemporary philosophy and theology, it also seems to be a poor reading of, I love your word pantheology as opposed to pantheism or panentheism. So I tend to use like pantheological now as a result of having read this book.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just here to popularize good ideas. So yeah, it seems to me to be a poor reading of pantheological like sources and ideas that are actually intrinsic to classic Western religions themselves. Like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have pantheological or panentheistic takes in their more developed philosophies, and that insist, very much like several dharmic religions, that there is a kind of non-dual unity between God and the world that invests something of divinity in the natural world and something of the worldly in God. My favorite advocate in the modern period would be like Sergius Bulgakov and his sophiology.
Right.
So if Abrahamic and Adonastic faiths are going to embrace the pantheological vision it would require something of a recovery of these muted aspects, but also openness to some new things coming down the pipeline in our cultural consciousness. So I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the new things that would have to structure kind of a renaissance of these ideas in our mainstream religions? Obviously, there's the option of just like, well, you don't need the mainstream religions. Like, you could just have all this stuff in a different context, but.
Sure. I don't know that it's necessarily new stuff. It might just be openness to old stuff in a slightly different key. So and I don't know that I always make this clear in the book itself, but I am really not looking to convert anybody to pantheism, a pluralist pantheism, pantheology, anything. I'm hoping, as you say, and I really appreciate your parsing of this so clearly. I'm hoping to encourage a non-panicked encounter of bald-faced pantheisms, particularly in their multiple forms. So as we find them in what's often called, animistic ontologies, in polytheistic ontologies, in people like William James, in people like Nicholas of Cusa, in people like Giordano Bruno, to encounter those sort of, again, bald-faced pantheologies, to consider what might be life-giving about them, and then to return to one's own tradition, if one has one, and find, as you're saying, the sort of pantheological elements therein, not in order to, dismantle everything about one's tradition if one wants to hold on to one's tradition, but to find ways of maybe living otherwise. So I'm very much not hoping to find one tradition to unite everybody, very much not hoping to get everybody on team pantheism. The best I can do with this is to tell a little story about having taken my students to meet some Benedictine nuns who live about an hour away from here. They are amazing. They're a fairly small community, but they have energy like you would not believe. Average age, probably 77 years old. They are cloistered, they are fully habited, and they are agrarian. And so in their full habits, they tend to ride around on tractors all day. Tractors, pickup trucks, in full habit. They are amazing.
I love it.
Yeah, they grow a good deal of their own food. They raise cattle, they raise sheep, they have alpaca, they have chickens, they lay their own eggs, they make their own cheese because some nun from Provence showed up at their door once and taught them how to make cheese after one of their nuns prayed for a French nun to teach them to make cheese. I mean, they are amazing women. And so my pantheologies class went to visit them, and we said, can we visit? And they said, yes, absolutely, come visit. But if you're going to visit, you're going to work. Okay. We showed up, we pulled tomato plants for hours and hours on end. And my students in their, their little block heels and their skinny jeans are pulling out tomato plants, and I'm pulling out tomato plants. And other students are putting asparagus to bed. I mean, they had us working for hours. We were exhausted. They were not. They were hauling wood. They were fine. And then finally, they took us into their chapel and said, all right, now, what do you want to talk about? And of course, some of the students wanted to talk about how it is that you give your life over to a community of other people like this, right? And you say, you leave your family and you commit to this, and how is it that people do that? There was a nun in her 20s or something, so they were really excited about the nun in her 20s. Like, what was it, right, that had you do this? But what they really wanted to talk about, of course, was theology. And the nuns were like, oh my God, we have no time for theology. Like, we have absolutely no time. We have to throw our asparagus to bed, but okay, ask us quickly. And the way that one of the students put it was, what is it about the Incarnation, God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, that prompts you to want to care as you do for the material world? And the sisters said, okay, well, all right. He said, it is in the incarnation of God in Christ that the material world regains its dignity and its beauty, and that the whole world is suffused with Christ. So it's our obligation as creatures to, you know, live into and care for this world. And the students were like, so are you saying that because God showed up in the person of Christ, in a sense, Christ is in the whole world? And they were like, yes. Like, so are you saying that following Christ amounts then for you to like taking care of the natural world? Yes. So when you care for the tomato plants, you're caring for Christ, for God. Sure. Then they said, so in a way that the tomato plants are God. And the nuns were like, no, what? No, the tomato plants are tomato, what? No, the tomato plants aren't God. The tomato plants are tomato plants. Like, what? No, like, are you joking? No, God is God. God showed up in one guy 2,000 years ago. He is not the tomato plants. He is not the cow. He is not the, like, God is not these things, right? And the students were like, and we're on our way home, and they were like, oh, it's so frustrating. You know, they're so awesome and they're so amazing, and we love them, and they were like so close to being pantheists, and then they have this like totally transcendent God, and it's so frustrating. And I was like, God, what is wrong with you? Like, what I found myself saying was, surely pantheists can have friends, right? Like, you don't have to get everybody on your team, on team pantheism. They are living in such a way that is not only respectful of, but like generative of this earth and all that's good therein. Who cares what their metaphysical commitments are, right? It's enough to find, so I think it's enough to find these like affective and ethical resonances and these, as you're saying, sort of pantheological moments in the traditions. I've had Jewish theologians write to me and be like, I love pantheologies. Only one problem. We got one God, just one, and he's out there. And we call him he, and like, I know, how do I be a Jewish theologian? And right, we don't have to get everybody on team pantheism in order to learn something from the more pantheological traditions in the world, and then see them at work in our own traditions, which, as you're saying, are they're not new. They're all the way back there in you know, rural ways of living, in, you know, the mystical teachings and things like that. So. Yeah,
and even, I mean, you know, Septuagint Ben Sirach 43:27, for he is the all, right? Or as my friend Jordan Daniel Wood, who has a forthcoming book on Maximus, would point out, I mean, you know, if you read Maximus just for what he says, he's very clear that like creation is incarnation. Like the incarnation and the creation of the universe are actually like the same thing. In Maximus's thought, and really for Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, like generally, it's there. I mean, there are various ways to read Chalcedon, but the Neo-Chalcedonians basically seem to read Chalcedon as a statement of non-dualism. Like the idea is just Christ is the horizon of the non-dual unity between God and the world for that reading. And I like what you're saying. Like, yeah, you know, no one has to be all on the same team to have broadly rhyming, like certain rhyming metaphysical commitments, and also to have sort of common values and practices. I like, sometimes when I want to be provocative to my evangelical Protestant friends, I will say something to the effect of like, you know, I really have, because I've been asked before, like you know, part of my training in religious studies was on South Asian religions. I really like have this lifelong love of Hinduism in addition to my own Christian faith and Judaism and what have you. And I was asked about it once, and I was like, well, you know, I really have more in common with a Hindu than I do with you. and you know, reasons being, I believe in the non-dual unity of God in the world. And also, I don't think that the world is this like dead, empty thing, the way that, you know, I mean, it just seems to me that so many of the religions born in America, like they have that very kind of modernist, very kind of, you know, avoiding the words disenchantment and enchanted and whatever, just like they have that's still their worldview, even when they're like fighting against, you know,
it's like the other inert background.
Yeah.
Against which the sort of drama of human becoming plays itself out, but it's just there. It's just a kind of given flat.
Yeah, I would much rather hang out with someone who thinks that like a thunderstorm is like Thor beating his hammer, or, you know, someone who like worships the mountain. It's like, no, yeah, I'm not going to worship the mountain, but like I get why you do. you know?
Sure.
And
And if you do, I won't put a 13th telescope on it, right? Like there
Yeah.
are ways that one can respect what other people hold sacred without having to sort of take it over as sacred in your own mind or thought or whatever, right?
Totally. This leads, as all things do, to the book you co-edited, Entangled Worlds, which proceeds from the observation that Western, especially Christian theology, has some, you call it materiaphobia, or fear of matter. And it's sort of ironic if you think about it, because as we're tracing these ideas, I mean, materiaphobia ends up reifying, I would argue, the very dualism that creatio ex nihilo is supposed to get rid of in its late antique context. So, you know, officially the idea in the 3rd and 4th century behind creatio ex nihilo is like, okay, there's no sort of secondary principle of matter that God has to like fight and tame. So in Gregory of Nyssa, you get it that like creatio ex nihilo really means creatio ex deo, like God creates out of nothing other than himself.
Right.
But the way that we talk about creatio ex nihilo today seems to like reify matter as this separate thing from God, right? Like it seems to reify this dualism. But there's this phenomenology of what you call the entangled worlds, cosmologically, biologically, that is much more lively, that does seem to create all these connections to more indigenous and animistic worldviews, as well as to, you know, non-Abrahamic, non-Western worldviews. And also to the sciences, to like what we're learning about the natural world today, where the most interesting kind of work is happening. Where is that interesting work? Where are those most interesting encounters between religion and philosophy and science happening when we consider the world as both living and interconnected for you? Sorry, that's a lot. All these questions are a lot. Answer them as you see fit.
Yeah, I was hung up on the ex nihilo thing. But I won't go there unless you want to go.
Please, yeah, wherever you want to go. It's like, let's digress.
Well, I mean, the quick thing to say about the ex nihilo is that that, as we know, theological debates are always also political and economic debates. And I have not yet found, up to and including recent astrophysical appeals to the ex nihilo, an example of an appeal to the ex nihilo that isn't also at the same time an effort to establish one way of knowing as superior to other ways of knowing. So it does this rhetorical work to establish one's own team as superior to everybody else's team that I think is worrisome. There's this little, do you know this kid's story? It's called Joseph Had a Little Overcoat. Joseph, this guy in a shtetl who's got an overcoat that becomes old and worn. It's a Caldecott winner. It's a whatever. I'm sure you'll come across it. It's called Joseph Had a Little Overcoat. Okay. Comes with a little song in the back that you got, had a little overcoat. It's very, very, chromatic. This is the la 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 la. Very 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 shtetl. And the Joseph has a little overcoat. It gets old and worn. He can't repair it, so he makes it into a jacket. And then the jacket gets old and worn, and so he makes it into a vest. And the vest gets old and worn, so he makes it into a scarf. And the scarf gets old and worn, so he makes it into a necktie. So he makes it into a handkerchief. So he makes it into something else. And he ultimately makes it into a button, and then the button pops off, and he loses it, and now he doesn't have it. And then the moral of the story is, therefore, it just goes to show that you can always make something out of nothing. That's the moral of the story. Read the story. 4 days later, my 4-year-old, 4 days later, my 4-year-old says, "Mommy, how do you make something out of nothing?" And I was like, I'm going to text Catherine Keller. Like, I can't believe you just asked me this question. I was like, well, honey, it's a great question. Why are you asking how you make something out of nothing? And he said, well, because that book says that you can always make something out of nothing, but Joseph doesn't make something out of nothing. He makes it out of his overcoat. I was like, right, this is right, that like there's always something in the story. There's always something that you can always make something out of what you have, is the moral of the story. It's not nothing, but it sounds somehow sexier or more amazing or more outlandish or more poetic to say something out of nothing, but it's not nothing. It's not ever anything, and it's not ever nothing. And what it is that's papered over in the story is usually something really important. Take home, for example, or the quantum flux, for example, or the laws of physics, or something, like all the stuff that gets reduced to nothing. Some maternal goddess, some or indeed the overcoat. So that's I guess the thing that I worry about the ex nihilo. Not that I contest it as an ontology. I mean, like, who knows? I don't know what everything comes from. I have no idea. But because rhetorically, it establishes some really clear winners and losers, and always seems to enact some pretty creepy power plays. And also, then it makes you a bad reader because you end up missing you miss the overcoat, you miss the quantum flux, you miss Tehom.
Yeah.
Okay, where do I see cool interactions of religion, philosophy, and sciences in accounts of the natural world? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, really quickly, just because I wanted to say, like, all of those concerns about ex nihilo, I totally affirm. The reason that I like Gregory specifically is because Gregory also combines this with an epistemology that says we can't actually know completely anything that exists, right? Like Gregory is one of those thinkers who I love, because for him, infinity is not like a reified concept. He's like, no, this is actually like, it's not just that you can't know like what God is in some sort of categorical sense. You also can't know like what a human being is, right? Like there's no like bottom that you can reach with anything that you're looking at and be like, oh, I fully, completely comprehend this thing. Which I love, because it is an epistemology and an ontology that proceeds from a kind of humility of like receptivity towards like, no, like, I mean, the better thing to do is to just experience everything and like journey into it, right?
Yes, and that is, I think, spiritually the way that you proceed when you have a kind of wonder-based epistemology, right? That's the way spiritually you proceed. I think ethically, the way you proceed is you ask which way of talking under which circumstances produces a way of living in the world that we can live with, and that our co-earth beings can live with. What kind of people does it make us to live into this sort of story? Yeah, which is because I'm so spiritually bereft, I tend to go for the ethical. But yes, of course, spiritually, that would be the way to proceed. Yeah.
No, totally. Listen, you're pointing back to the ethical is very important for me as someone who can easily get lost in the like, no, but wouldn't it be cool if the kind of bigger metaphysical stuff. It's one of the things I appreciate about your work, that like you have this amazing ability to kind of like go to the heights and the depths of the topic, and then to be like, yeah, and then like, so what are you going to do about it? How do these stories kind of influence what you choose to do? So yes, anyway, question was, in talking about entangled worlds and talking about what we know from like the natural sciences, both like physics and biology, and how these fields are developing and our sense of the interconnectedness of things. How is that shaping, how do I want to phrase this? What's the most interesting encounter, or what are the most interesting encounters happening between like theology and science, or religion and science, or philosophy too, in those worlds at the moment?
Do you know of any? I tend to find the relationship between theology and science, religion and science, still to be pretty dismal. I don't know of a lot of great encounters between them. I think that somehow we're still stuck in this terrible model of well, there are like three options. Either you play the I know you are, but what am I game, where the theist accuses the atheist of heresy and the atheist accuses the theist of stupidity, and that's just terrible. Or you do the Stephen Jay Gould move of non-overlapping magisteria, and you say that science tells us what is, and religion tells us what ought to be, or religion tells us what to do with the is, or something like that. And then you avoid the conflict, but then you affirm the total division of the two of them. Or you do this terrible move of like a theologian reads a whole bunch of like Brian Greene and then like reports on what the sciences says and then shows how you can still affirm an omnipotent, benevolent God in the face of whatever the scientific discovery is sort of like reconciling. But all three of these models assume a fundamental conflict and then sort of move from there. The way I try to kind of get around this and take it from a different approach instead is to work in a more sort of religious studies mode and look at the sciences as like data for the religious studies person, and to say like, look at this, there's some really cool stuff coming out of the sciences, like really cool stories, really cool myths, really cool gods and monsters and things like that. And we can look at those and construct them and account for them without having to say whether they're right or wrong. We don't need to, or without having to say whether they, prove or disprove Christianity, or they show that really Buddhism had it right all along, or something like that, which are all these ways that people tend to talk about. So I don't know. I would love to see. I think that. Probably the most exciting encounters between religion and science are going on in like the intentional communities that our students are managing to make after they graduate. And some evangelical students do this, some Roman Catholic students do this, some Jewish students do this on kibbutzim and things like that, like where their life in community allows them both to learn more about the natural world and to learn how to care for it and dwell within it, and also connect them to the source of the stuff that binds them together. And that's great, but that I don't see it really happening in any in many academic discourses, for what that's worth.
Yeah, I like that. I like that answer, though, pointing to communities that are in some sense keeping alive the academic education, but also pointing it towards like, how do we build community with each other and with the earth? So, like last year, I built these 2 really large garden beds in my backyard. I grow vegetables and fruit and, all kinds of stuff. And last year, I was delighted to see that other things were just kind of growing up with my plants that I hadn't planted. Like there were mushrooms growing under my zucchini. And I was just like, wow, okay. I feel like my, amateur garden brain immediately thinks like, oh, I got to get rid of the mushrooms. But I paused myself and was just like, well, why is that growing there? Right? Like, why is it the case that this seemed like an inviting spot? Right. And did a little research and discovered like, oh no, this is actually really good for the zucchini, for this to be here. It makes the soil richer. The fungus and the plants are like helping each other out in different ways. It's that real encounter with like nature, even in a controlled setting, that was more enlivening for me last year. I mean, I read a lot last year, but it was more enlivening for me than like any particular book that I read. Was just like, wow, but like this is the real thing, right? I read all the books just to kind of like be able to think about it a little bit better, but this is the real thing. I think that like when I read through some of the essays in Entangled Worlds, that was the thing that kind of stuck out to me about how to have a non-materia phobia, based like worldview if you're working either in religious studies or in theology or in whatever, is that I get the sense that like a lot of people who work with this stuff are not also then going out, right, and just being in the world, whether that's the human world, whether that's the natural world, whether that's some combination of the two. I don't know. I've worked with like a lot of academics who are very engaged with like life outside of the university, and then there are like a lot of them I've worked with who it's like, no, this is the world,
Yeah, right. Which is totally fine, but as we know, getting a really solid body affirming ontology isn't enough actually to, change the well-being of bodies in the world, right? We don't get from ideas to practice almost ever. You get from your practice to your ideas. And so you go out and you build your little garden, and then you figure out which of those things that you've been reading get affirmed therein and how they need to be tweaked and how they need to be changed. I've been finding recently that having two little kids, I'm out in the world a lot more than I've ever been, because you just have to get them outside, just like get them out of the house, because they will destroy the house. They will destroy the house. So you get them outside and you go on these walks, and they look at everything and they find everything, and it's so attuning, right, to like the small stuff, like to the stuff that's like right here in your front yard, in your backyard, in your around your corner, in your neighborhood. And I find that the questions that and the practices that come out of those little walks are so like laser focused. It's like I'll be walking with my 5-year-old, and he loves sticks. He's a stick kid. I'll have a stick, and he recently I found him take a stick and beat a tree with it. And I was like, no, I mean, I just found myself very instantaneously and in a very commanding phallic way saying like, no, you may not hit that tree with that stick. And he was like, why? And at that point, you can't appeal to some lofty ontology to explain why you can't hit a tree. Like, you have to say something very quickly, very carefully, and very clearly about what it is that makes a tree something that you can't hit, and what it makes, and why he can hit the sidewalk instead if he wants to hit something. Absolutely hit the sidewalk. Do whatever you want to the sidewalk, but do not hit that tree. And here's why, right? It's that, like, I find those moments so helpful in sharpening my ontology, much more than I find my ontology helpful in sharpening my practice. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. Well, and that also kind of wraps back around to why I don't like theories of religion as like a discipline, because it often begins with, here's the big idea, and I'm going to kind of descend from the big idea to this is where we get religion. I much more belong to the camp that thinks that like religion is a response to experiences, like personal experiences, communal experiences, mediated experiences, whatever. And religion seems, to me at least, to survive or die on the basis of like how successfully it continues to explain experience. And whether that experience can be successfully transmitted, right? I was talking with the last people I interviewed for the show, and they asked me kind of like why I started doing this and why I got into it. And I was like, well, one of the things that I found as I was growing up was that, like, in my religious community, a lot of people would leave, but a lot of the reason that they would leave would be because there was no one around to kind of like successfully explain the experience to them, and who could also listen to their experience, like without judgment and with a kind of receptivity to understand kind of why other things were making sense to them, or why nothing was making sense to them, or whatever. And maybe that's a wonder thing too, right? Is just like beginning from a place of like, yeah, so what are you experiencing, right? Like, what are you aware of? I totally agree. Like, kids, even my 7-month-old, I notice things about the way she experiences the world, or seems to, that she broadcasts, that are like very different from the way I'm habituated to think about the world. Like, we have a dog who is currently sleeping over on the couch very nicely while we do this interview. And it occurred to me the other day, I was like, Catherine has no concept of she has no category for the idea that Daisy is a different sort of being than her mom and I are. In her experience, it's just like, there's Daisy, there's us, there are the flowers in the garden. There, there's no conceptual walls up between any of these things yet.
Yeah, I think when my oldest one was little, he thought he would grow up and become an ancient white cat, because that's who the old person was in our household. Like, he would just turn into a cat. that was the path. Yeah.
I mean, sounds good.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like a bad life. Okay, you have a book on the way that I am extremely excited to read, Astrotopia, The Dangerous Religion of the Corporate Space Race. The publisher's description points out that we live in kind of a weird moment where, and you alluded to this earlier, on the one hand, our human civilizations are in like collective and multiple individual crises that are also affecting everything else on the planet. While at the same time, we are looking at like the dawn of a new space race, both politically, where governments are once again competing with each other, and billionaires are kind of pushing the buck on this too, to try and colonize space. And as the description goes on, the myths that are motivating these projects are not new. It's it's which myths are being used and which myths are kind of motivating our collective dreams of cosmic expansion here. When I learned about this book, I immediately thought of M. David Litwaw's work on deification in ancient religion, which makes largely the same point around things like transhumanism or modern superheroes. Like, actually, people have always wanted to become gods and have had religious technologies for doing so. And these are simply more or less secular forms of that desire in a world that's maybe a little bit less traditionally religious than it used to be. Without spoiling, because everyone should buy the book, but by way of plugging the book, what are the bad myths motivating the space race? What are some better myths for cosmic exploration? And above all, when do I get to be a captain in Starfleet? When does Star Trek happen?
Yeah, that would be a good myth, right? That would be a good myth, a sort of peaceful exploration in which we somehow manage not to interfere. That's not the one. Some of the bad myths motivating the contemporary iteration of the space race. One, bad myth that land can be owned. Bad myth. It's a specific one, comes out of a particular culture, comes out of a particularly bad reading of ex nihilo theology, endorses, as we know, the idea that Europe can take the lands inhabited and caretaken for millennia by their original stewards. So the idea that land can be owned, the idea that the stuff of the land, which is to say the stuff within the land, which is say metals, etc., are resources that ought to be exploited. I mean, this is a term that they still use in a good way, that we can exploit these resources, that those resources ought to be exploited for monetary profit, that economic expansion is an untrammeled good, right? Because then it's the pursuit of economic expansion at all costs that requires us to have more raw goods, that requires us to treat resources as resources, that requires us to privatize land. Bad myths, the idea that that land is empty and inert. The notion of terra nullius, that land is belonging to no one, it ought to be yours because it's empty, because motivated the expansion into the Americas, the expansion across the Americas, the expansion into Australia, of Europe, certainly into Africa. The idea was that there was nobody there and the land didn't belong to anybody, therefore it was Europe's. Even the most energetic of space, like would-be space colonizers, will say like, oops, that was a mistake, right? Clearly that land did belong to somebody, clearly that land, but this time, the moon doesn't belong to anybody. Therefore it can be ours. Like this, now we definitely have a terra nullius we can stand behind. Terra nullius is perhaps the most dangerous myth animating the new space race. Mars belongs to nobody, therefore it can be, because there's nobody there. There's nobody there. There are no indigenous people there. But if you talk to like actual indigenous people living here on this earth and ask them, is there anybody there? They'll say like, yeah, of course there are people. Not everybody, but many people will say. Bawaka country in northern Australia will say like, yeah, our ancestors live in the Milky Way. They live in the stars. So when we act disrespectfully toward the like interplanetary space, we are literally disrupting the habitations of our ancestors and interrupting the sacred processes that happen between us and our ancestors, between the divine and the human, between the, of course there are people there. Of course there are people, Inuit, our ancestors live on the moon. They live on the moon, right? And it's only according to a particular ontology, it's not just science, like, right, it's not a sort of objective science, that we can say that there's nobody there to be disturbed, and that therefore this land ought to be exploited within an inch of its life for everything that it must contain. Bad myths, the idea that there is something unfixable about this world, and that therefore we need to aim for another world and create an other world elsewhere, the sort of myth of utopia. The myth that this world is unfixable and that there is, in some place that nobody has ever been to before, Mars, for example, a promised land, a place that we can go. All we need to do is destroy the world as it is and remake it in our image, and therefore we will be able to live it. Okay, these are all bad myths, right? Better myths, again, not because they're true, but because I think that they would encourage better ways of living, would center on the agency of land, the way that it has of acting, of providing, of having intention. If you look at the videos of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin trying to plant the flag on the moon, you will see the moon does not want that flag, doesn't want it. It's like, no, thank you. It is apparently, there's apparently nothing between, and they didn't realize this, there's nothing between lunar dust and like regolith. Like so they thought they'd be able to, but they were like, oh my God. So they're like trying, and the moon is like kicking up dust storms, and it's like, and the minute they got it up and the camera moved on, the flag fell over because it like, so Mars doesn't want us there. Mars clearly doesn't want it. Mars will destroy you. Mars will kill you so fast, right? There seem to be things that the land tells us about how to relate to it. So myths that talk instead about listening to land, about listening to the more than human world and learning from it how to relate to it, those are the ones that I think we need to center in this particular chapter of our existence.
Yeah, so it's a rude thing to do to a goddess to like get there and try to plant a flag, right? Like
they named this mission, so the mission that's going back to the moon in order to mine all of its water and call it and turn it into a cosmic gas station. They say this approvingly. We're going to turn the moon into a gas station so we can refuel at the moon and then do other missions, because it's easier. The escape velocity is a lot lower on the moon, so you can take off much more easily for a bigger mission. So turn the moon into a gas station, and use it as a military base, and use it as a way that you can basically target anywhere on Earth if you can learn to navigate the moon well enough. That is named Artemis. It's named after a goddess. It's named after a person, like a figure whom like people still revere, right? So there's this like terrible desecration that even knows what it's doing and tries to like sanctify the desecration as somehow not even holy, but like awesome, right? By calling it Artemis.
There was so NASA, to advertise the Artemis program, put out a commercial in like 2019. It was called like "We Are Going." And I showed this to my students when both as a rhetoric exercise and then also in our mythology unit. Like we read Gilgamesh, we talked about like, what does Gilgamesh have to say about human beings and like our destiny and everything? It's not great. And then we watched the episode of Star Trek where they meet Apollo, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, so this is a very different kind of myth of humanity and human destiny. What is this one doing? And, they got to watch Kirk, be Kirk, and Shatner his way around and everything. And so then I showed them this video that NASA put out, we are going, like, here's all the technology, here's our explanation. We're going to go there. We're going to be there to stay by 2024. And like some of the lines in this are, I mean, really, like it's a very effectively made, commercial. It's like, we are going for humanity, like to the moon and to Mars and beyond. And then I was like, anyone happen to know whose voice that is? And the kids were all like, I I recognize it, but I can't, like, I feel like we recently heard it, and I replayed the episode. It's Shatner. It's like, guys, can you imagine the rhetorical value of this? Like, if you grew up in the 60s, right, and the space race is going on, what's on TV while your government is telling you they're going to the moon? It's Star Trek, right? Like, this is a multi-faceted, multi-layered kind of mythology in our culture that kind of goes up and down dependent on where the government money is flooding. But like, you guys happen to be living through a time where this is going to start getting really big again. And it's important. And like, this was my whole pitch for the mythology unit. I was like, look, I don't really care if you don't like, you know, like ancient gods and heroes stories and whatever. Like, I like them, but you don't have to like them. The main thing you should know is that this mythology is still huge. Like, it still influences everything we do in various ways. You knowing the original stories helps you to identify when they're being co-opted for something today, right? Yeah, so like, how do we, so like a better myth we talked about would be like, you know, Star Trek, like we are explorers, but we're non-interventionist. It seems to me like our myths of cosmic exploration also intersect with like other pop culture myths that, you know, have like a big religious kind of, like we saw over the course of the pandemic, a new explosion in public attention to like UFO or UAP, right? Like with the various like New York Times articles and whatever. I, like you, am more interested in what that says about us, like in terms of what we care about, right? Like we seem to be really interested in thinking about like, oh yeah, like we just belong to this bigger world, right? That we can join if we just colonize the moon or whatever, or colonize Mars. What are some of the things that the more attention we give to that mythology, we are not paying attention to that we have to pay attention to here? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah, it does. A couple things. So when you say that the sort of our endeavors in space say, look, there's this whole bigger world we can join. I don't think that's what they're saying. I think they're saying the opposite, and I think that's precisely the problem. I think they're saying, look at that world that we can make ours. Look at that bigger, that more terrain that we can bring into our world, make it ours. We bring the moon down. We're not like really bringing ourselves, we're gonna bring the moon down. We're gonna bring the Mars down to our mode of existence. If the question were, how do we join that world? That would be a totally different question, right? Because if you ask how you're gonna join a world, you have to say, what are the mores on that world? What is it, again, like what is this planet? What is this orb need from us? How are you supposed to behave on this orb? Not, well, we're used to air conditioning, therefore we're going to bring air conditioning. We're used to war, therefore we're going to bring war. We're used to making money, we're going to bring making money, right? It's like the wrong direction. So one of the things that I try to say in the book is that it would be helpful, rather than asking how the universe might belong to us, if we ask like, how could we belong to the universe? Like, how can we become part of this bigger community? And I think that the tragedy of alien imaginations is that the aliens are always out to get us. They're always coming to destroy us, and we always have to fend them off. There's always war. It's always either they're coming to destroy us or they're coming to like experiment on us and do nasty things to us. You know, but I was talking to this wonderful Afrofuturist, Ingrid Lafleur, who she was talking to me and this astrobiologist, wonderful guy, David Grinspoon. And she was like, yeah, I don't know, man, maybe the reason that we're not getting contacted by aliens is that they don't like the way we're behaving, right? Like maybe, would you want to have anything to do with us, right? Everywhere we're like probing asteroids, what the hell? We just jam a thing into it and see how you can explode it and then see what happens when you explode it. Like that's our big scientific, that's our big like technological gesture, right? Is to like punch the hell out of something and then see what happens to it when you punch it, make it explode and like then look at it. And David started laughing so hard. He was like, that is maybe the funniest resolution to Fermi's paradox I've ever heard, right? Fermi's paradox, there must be like, the universe must be teeming with life. Where is everybody? Answer, they don't want to have anything to do with us. Like, why would they want to have anything to do with us? I think it would really help if we, talking about good myths, if we were to ask instead, not ask like, do aliens exist or not, but like, if aliens did exist, how would we want to conduct ourselves in the cosmos to make ourselves the kind of beings they'd want to interact peacefully with? Not like what happens when they come and how do we blow them up, or
we are precisely the species that like the prime directive forbids interacting with, right? we are
still on their way.
Yeah, we are like marked for cosmic quarantine. Yeah, I mean, this is also how arguably like the Kardashev scale solves the Fermi's paradox, right? That like a civilization of type 1 or type 2 that may or may not be more or less like us, like greedy, exploitative, like whatever, probably doesn't have the tech to actually like make contact with us. A type 3 civilization that would have the tech to make contact with us wouldn't be interested in the kind of expansionism that in imperialism, you know, like they might be interested in us like joining a larger collective or a federation or something like that. But yeah, I mean, like it seems to me exactly as you put it, like the question, are aliens real? I mean, you can study that as far as it's possible. It's not very possible, right? Like you can ask that question. More interesting question is like, why are we so consistently interested in aliens, the possibility of aliens? Like, how does that worldview shape the kinds of things that we're doing? How does it shape our like cosmic expansionism? Well, I mean, to some extent, right? It's like, it was interesting to me that when, for example, the Pentagon had to give its hearing to Congress on UFO, UAP, the big question, the big overarching narrative in that was, this is a threat to national security. In other words, this is a military problem. Like we might be caught unable to deal with this, right? And it's like, and your question is not, I just saw a thing fly through the sky and I have no explanation for it.
How do we obliterate it?
Yeah, like how do we? It's like, oh my gosh, the people who make all of these decisions just have, frankly, all of the wrong opinions about things.
In response to the second part of your question, which was about what we're missing when we focus our energies out there, I think the great place to go back is William Shatner, honestly. I don't know if you saw after he came back from his flight with Jeff Bezos, that interview with him, there's footage of him.
I don't think I watched that one, no.
Astonishing. And I honestly, I wrote an op-ed piece about it that I couldn't quite get shopped out appropriately because I was so taken by nobody's actually listening to what he said, which was that he said he came down, he was absolutely beside himself. He was crying, he was shaking, he was, and he was like, you hear about this whole thing about the overview effect, how like you get out there and then suddenly you realize, oh, the world is so small, why can't we all just get along or something like that. He's like, I was expecting that, whatever. It's not that. He's like, it's that there's this covering, he says, this blanket of like blue, this blue blanket that covers all of us. He's like, we zipped through it in a second. We got out there. He's like, and there was nothing there. And he's like, is that death? Is that, and Bezos is like, okay, dude, like, and starts getting sort of uncomfortable. And he's like, I think that's death. And like, this is life and that's death. And Bezos is like, hang on a second, I'm just gonna open the champagne. And then the champagne goes everywhere. I was like, you're going back, William Shatner went to space. Oh my gosh, it's so amazing, William Shatner went to space. And Shatner's like, no, I need you to listen to me. Like everything we know of life itself is here and out there is death. And this is not what I expected. Like I have been thinking myself into outer space forever and it's just fucking death out there, right? It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And then they got him on some daily shows and he kept saying like, that's death, this is life, that's death, this is life. And they were like, okay, so you had a really good time. He's like, what I'm trying to say is we have to take care of this planet. And they were like, so you think everybody should go on Jeff Bezos's rocket ship? And he's like, I'm saying we need to take care of this planet. We need to heal it. We need to fix it. And they're like, well, thanks. I'm so glad you had such a good time out there, William Shatner. Thank you. And goodbye. Right. We don't seem to be able to get that message across, right? Whatever it is that it's kind of the way that, you know, that like the sciences do this funny like two-step often of being like, isn't it amazing, you know, the church was so stupid to think that humans were at the center of things. Isn't it amazing that science shows us how small and puny humanity is, and it's, you know, finally chastising us and disciplining us for the first time, and we realize that the universe is huge and we're just a small part, and we're the only beings who can know this absolute truth of the universe, and isn't it so amazing how awesome we are, right? Like the line here seems to be something like, it's enormous and vast out there, and this is really important, therefore we should go out there and spend all of our energy out there. And this is just a complete misconstruction of what the deal is. So if there were a way to approach the cosmos and the exploration of the cosmos in more of a key of, I guess, what you'd call wonder or something like that, which is to say, with a willingness to be shocked and even transformed by what we discover, rather than by bringing our plan of action out to it, then I feel like I could commend it. When it comes to our, like, the resources we currently have and the tools that we're bringing to the current exploration of the cosmos, we should probably just not do it.
Yeah, much more like Dante or Lewis's space trilogy for thinking about the cosmos than like Asimov's like Foundation or something, right? Or like, you know, it's that quest that I do think is legitimate to, you know, how do you take all of this amazing cosmology stuff that we now have that we didn't even have like 100 years ago, right? And how do you sort of reignite a sacred imagination about that, when the people who are most often kind of, you know, communicating that cosmology stuff to the culture are also the same people who are usually saying what you're saying, right? Which is that, like, oh yeah, like it's all just out there for the taking, right? Like it's out there for the, you know, like we've exiled the gods from the stars and from the planets, and you know, it's no longer heaven, it's just space, right? Just go take. It's like, surely there has to be a middle ground. Surely there has to be a way to inhabit sort of like both ways of thinking about reality. But again, that would require that the people who are doing this on either side are like people who have wonder as a virtue, right? Yeah. Well, I'm having a ton of fun. I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm also out of pre-written questions. I guess maybe first of all, I hope you'll agree to do this again sometime. This was great fun for me. And second, I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what, beyond this book that's forthcoming, what are some other projects in the ether that you're comfortable talking about that we might look forward to?
I don't have it fully formulated yet, but I'm thinking of turning next to the category of pseudoscience, where the category comes from, who accuses whom of it under what circumstances, and how does it become a polemic term for the natural sciences in particular? What are they trying to distance themselves from? So I think that the project will probably take root in the early modern world, with the emergence of what will eventually call itself natural science, out of witchcraft, alchemy, and astrology. I think that this is where we're going next.
That sounds awesome. I'm excited. So yeah, Dr. Rubenstein, this was a blast. Have a great summer. I look forward to talking again sometime.
Thanks, I really appreciate it.
Bye.